Let me just also echo the land acknowledgement and recognise that I'm you from what is currently known as Sydney, Australia. This is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. This is unceded land, um, and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Australia has much to do in relation to reconciliation. Unfortunately, came up for constitutional vote a couple of years ago and was defeated to actually formally acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in our constitution. So just to kind of echo that there is much work still to be done in the process of reconciliation all around the world. And I think that's relevant for what I want to talk to you about this evening, in terms of the fact that I understand service to be service design, to be the creation of relation, not the creation of relationships. In a way, one could say it's not possible for me as a settler to be in an automatic relationship with Indigenous people, but I can be in relation. I can recognize the difference. I can recognize two worlds overlapping in a kind of pluriversal sense, and that service is this miraculous way in which strangers collaborate. And I think it was with that spirit that I rather cruelly and very academically returned many of you to your schooling by assigning you a large chapter from Dave Graeber's Debt, if you managed to get through it. It's when I read it again, I suddenly thought it's not so easy to read as I thought the first time. I really, really it changed my mind about lots of things when I first read it. And I have used it quite a lot to teach service design. But I did think, as I did this, particularly if you don't know the book and if you don't know Dave Graeber, and particularly if you're just totally focused on commercial service design, maybe you wouldn't have come tonight if you were. But if you just encounter that chapter, I think you would suddenly think, what on earth is going on? But I'll try and introduce and I'll try and just take you quickly through it. But I really want to make some time for questions. I'm hoping everyone can hear me fine. I normally sort of go into lecture mode and speak very loudly, but my family is asleep at the other end of this quite small house. So I will try and not keep them awake by speaking too loudly. So I'm just going to share and take you through, just by way of introduction. Okay, so as you all know, I'm going to talk to you about what I think you can learn from David Graeber's work as a service designer. I should indicate that I came to service design primarily through sustainable design. So my background is primarily trying to advocate for ecological sustainability. And in the early 2000s, a lot of us sustainability researchers were trying to work out how society could be less materials intense. And one of the strategies that was common at that time was to convince, to say that what we needed to do was convince people to own less and use more. And there was some horrible jargon, dematerialization, servicization, product service systems, and moving from ownership to usership. If you move to usership rather than owning a product, you're obviously moving from a retail economy to a service economy. One of the things that happened when we were doing that work, when I started thinking about it, is it made me realize that unsustainability, in terms of us having too much stuff, if you ask, like, why did we do that? One argument is people are just greedy consumers. I don't think that's a particularly intelligent way to think about the problem. What sort of happened on a certain read of the 20th century in the global consumer class, starting with the global North Atlantic countries and their sort of empires? What happened was that people were convinced that it was more convenient to own something than to go through the awkwardness of negotiating with people. It sort of freed you as a consumer, as an individualistic household, to own things rather than to engage in services. If we're going to be more sustainable in the 21st century, we have to kind of reverse what happened in the 20th century. We need to return to human-powered interactions, human-powered services. So that was a lot of the work I was doing. At that point, because we were trying to convince people really against what they wanted. So recognizing that most people see the freedom that comes from being able to have enough money to buy stuff to stick in your garage so that at any time you can go skiing or fishing or mow the lawn or whatever it is. Um, if we were going to convince people that they should not own a lawnmower but share a lawnmower or use a lawn mowing service, if we were going to convince people, there was this big question of how could you compete against the convenience of ownership? And it was at that point that I really started thinking the power of design can help people move to these people-based economies. That if you're going to try and do that work, you actually can use the power of design to make services attractive. There were lots of complications at that time. It didn't always mean it was more sustainable, and it wasn't entirely successful. This was all sort of pre-social media and smartphones. So this was 2003, 2004, 5, 6, 7. I think we were kind of doing this work. But that's how I came to service design. Service design was a means of trying to get us to a less materials intense future and to share more. Um, as was indicated by Aaron's introduction, most of the work that I do these days is around transition design. And I was doing a lot of what could be called pro-social design, coming out of a design against crime context. This was work designing out crime done by Case Dorst. And at a certain time, I was working with a lot of researchers to work out how do you make interventions into communities in order to disafford antisocial interactions. So again, that's service design writ large as how do you create relations between people and cooperations between people that will disafford criminality in certain circumstances. Both of those sound quite academic, and I just want to sort of indicate for the audience that a lot of this work was applied research. And in fact, most of the pro-social design that I did was with financial institutions. So a lot of it was scam prevention or banks wanting to do things around helping victims of domestic violence. A lot of work in that kind of context. So we were doing service design with financial institutions in order that they could help customers be more financially healthy because they were less subject to scams or less subject to antisocial interactions, etc. So that was just a quick kind of sense of where I'm coming from in terms of service design. As I said at the outset, I tend to think service design is about getting strangers to cooperate. That would be my definition of service design. One of the primary ways to do that is to not depend upon people doing it individually, negotiating, one customer negotiating with a service worker. But instead, we have these host organizations who actually facilitate that collaboration and they make a customer feel sort of safer about approaching somebody to help them with their issues because that person is acting as an agent of an organization. So services always have this triadic component, which I think is often glossed over when people have a superficial understanding of customer-centered. Tends to think about only sort of organization and customer, and the service worker is left out. Or people think about the micro interactions between customer and service worker and sort of forget about the power of the host organization in that way. So I think it's always important to remember that as a sort of triadic relation. So I don't know how familiar people are with Dave Graeber. Certainly debt drew him to popular attention. More famously, his sort of bullshit jobs, the claim that if you ask people, if you stop doing your job tomorrow, would it really matter? And according to his anecdotal sort of research, 30% of people think that there's no need to do their job, or it wouldn't really matter if they didn't do their job. They didn't really feel like they mattered in terms of their work. So that's what he's famous for. It's important to recognize he's a trained anthropologist. Did his field work in Madagascar. There's a posthumous book published by him called Pirate Enlightenment, which is also about Madagascar, which was sort of a place in which many pirates actually went and settled. And he makes an argument that modern forms of democracy actually come out more out of Madagascar and the pirates there than they do out of Athenian democracy or anything that we might tell ourselves about those Western traditions. But he is a trained anthropologist. It's a problematic discipline in terms of its colonial legacy, but it's a discipline that takes very seriously its colonial legacy and tries to deal with it. He is someone who learnt several languages in order to try and understand the people he was interacting with in Madagascar in lots of different settings. So he's somebody, I think, when you read particularly that chapter and the kind of anecdotes in it, they can feel like dangerously stereotyping. I didn't give you the references. Every anecdote comes from somewhere. It is a field work. Some of them have been turned into cliches and turned into stories that are caricatures. But I think you can always recognize that when Graeber makes a story like that, he does have the actual chops to indicate that there is some basis for making that. So he's an anthropologist, but he was also very politically active. So he was very, very active in the anti-globalization movement at the beginning, end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. So a lot of the really big anti-World Bank, for example, some of you might not be old enough to remember those quite amazing, almost revolutionary moments. He participated in that and then wrote a kind of ethnography called Direct Action. He was a sort of lead instigator of Occupy Wall Street, which he claims really refused him to tenure and the ability to get a job in the United States. Eventually, sort of relocated to London School of Economics, to Goldsmith, sorry, in London. So he is an anarchist anthropologist. And I just wanted to say something very quickly about anarchy. A lot of people, if you say the word anarchy, they think about bomb throwing terrorists and people who don't like the state and don't like rules of any sort. And I think this is important to recognize that's a fundamental misunderstanding of anarchy. Anarchy is not anti-rule. It's a way of self-organizing such that anybody at any time can make an argument for no longer obeying those rules. So rather than accepting rules as fixed, anarchy is a way of organizing, self-organizing society in which people are constantly consenting to being in relation in a particular way. So Graeber is an anthropologist and he was an activist and he was an anarchist. And I think that version of self-organizing, that version of what it means to actually imagine that rules are sort of created on the fly and that people are always agreeing to them, means service design becomes a very interesting thing to look at because service design is, in that way, a type of anarchy. It's a moment in which people are co-designing being in relation temporarily or regularly over time as an organization. So that's why I think we can learn something about service design by looking at Dave Graeber. I think you can learn a lot of service design by looking at a lot of the great sociologists. I think looking at Garfinkel and ethnomethodology, I think understanding something about Irving Goffman and role play, presentation of everyday self. I think that'd be a really great service design degree in which it was based on a lot of these key thinkers. So it's in that tradition that I'm speaking. Too long, sorry. So I just want to begin with this question just to help you sort of get into what I think that chapter was about. I wonder if you could just in your mind indicate whether you think people are fundamentally self-interested. The somewhat opposite of that is to say people are fundamentally caring. They tend to have a very hard to repress capacity for empathy. When they see somebody in need, they tend to go and help them. So obviously, if you come from Homo economicus, they're very self-interested. A lot of people will look at human nature, so-called, and say, look, they're all just selfish people who are out for themselves, and that's why we have wars and this kind of thing. But then, people love, people get in relation, people help strangers. So I wonder if you can just think about where you sit on that spectrum. Obviously, most of us, I suspect, think everybody is a bit of both, I hope, that there are moments in which the caring might be self-interested and moments in which the self-interested might be caring. But you might have a philosophy, an ideology, a worldview that holds them one or the other. Dave Graeber asks the question, okay, well, within that, where then is the feeling of being indebted? If debt is the idea that you owe somebody some money, he sort of just asks, why do we feel an obligation to pay a debt? Why the word in many languages is the same as the word for guilt. So to be in debt is to feel guilty about the debt. There is a sort of moral imperative. And if you think about debt, it's something obviously that underpins a whole bunch of self-interested economic relations, but it's also a kind of obligation that people have an ethical feel, duty, a sense of duty. And so it doesn't kind of fit with self-interest. But nor is being indebted a type of care. It can be a type of care to feel like you owe somebody something, but the burden component doesn't really fit with care. So I just do this by way of conceptual introduction. If you just think, are people self-interested or caring? The feeling indebted is somewhere in between or not at all between them. And Graeber's just asking that question as he writes a doorstop of a book to just say, why do we feel this obligation? And one would imagine as an anarchist, he's like, no, we should just get rid of it all. And this chapter is him kind of saying, that's not at all. You have to sort of consider what it means to be in relation to people. And that relation is not just competitive self-interest, nor is it brotherly love. Occasionally, it's very complicated anthropological sets of obligation. And that's what you need to be thinking about. When I'm in a service relation, when I'm in need of expert help, it might be a bodily health issue, I am trusting somebody with my body. I am choosing somebody and I'm prepared to actually sort of put myself in a position to even suffer pain in the name of trying to be made better. So that's a weird relation between self-interest and care, and it seems to me to be something like debt. And that you can think about service relations through debt. So that's why I thought we should think about this. And then I'll just try and whip it quite quickly sort of through the argument, just using some kind of quotes. He begins with some troubling, feeling stereotypical kind of stories of Westerners arriving in places and just feeling totally baffled by other people. It tells a couple of stories of people saving somebody's life. And then that person whose life had been saved, rather than sort of feeling grateful, suddenly starts acting it looks avaricious. It looks like they're trying to get something. And Graeber's like, well, you can't just be baffled by this. You've got to try and understand why this might happen, and gives an explanation like the one I've got on the page, that if something extraordinary happens, you'll feel like you're in relation to someone. You'll literally feel like they're a relation of yours. And if they're a relation of yours, then they will share with you beyond that. So in fact, the life-saving doesn't free them, it actually puts you in relation. And this is what baffled people. So he uses this just as a way of, this is his anecdotal way of asking the question that I just asked, which is, what is this sense of obligation and debt, and why do people help each other? That's the fundamental question. Why on earth do strangers help each other? We understand why people who aren't strangers help each other. They supposedly have a loving relation of some sort, whether it's actual genetic relation or being in love, romantic love, or being part of the same community and therefore having a kind of bond. Graeber, as an anthropologist, sort of puts it around the other way. How do I know that I'm in love with someone? It's the fact that I will do anything for them at any time. I'm in a service relation to them. I don't like to call it service because I think services are not relationships. But instead, you can start to see that if somebody helps you, it will create a whole bunch of complicated human interactions. That every time you service design, you're suddenly in this anthropological bafflement realm. So then he has these three kind of categories, what he calls sort of base level communism, which is the idea that people will just help somebody if they're in need. So this is the basic sort of mantra of communism, from each according to his capacities, to each according to his needs. So, in this kind of way, if somebody needs help, I help them. And he sort of asks, well, why do we do this? And he suggests that there's a kind of idea that, yes, it's reciprocal, but I'm not actually looking for something from you right now. Some people call it reciprocal altruism, which is the idea that if you act altruistically, you're not only being altruistic, which means you do it purely as a gift. You do expect something to come back, but you don't expect it to come back right now, and not necessarily from that person. So you move into a situation more in which you've generated goodwill. But it's important to remember that this is occurring between strangers. And I think this is just a really interesting thing to start thinking about in terms of services. So in each of these cases, I'll just highlight some examples. I think one of the fundamental questions that all service designers should always ask is, in this service interaction, at the beginning of the service interaction, or maybe halfway through this service interaction, do people introduce themselves? And I think it's important to recognize that there are many services in which it would be important that somebody not identify themselves, either as a customer out of a kind of privacy, or because they're just trying to get a sense of the service before actually committing to it. So actually allowing them to be anonymous, not pressuring them to give a name early on. This is the terrible thing about interaction design. Forces you to create an account before you do anything every single time. Create a profile. Tell me who you are. I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes services do need to be anonymous. Sometimes you don't need to know the name of the service worker. You just need to know that this person is there playing a role. Obviously, most of us come from a kind of particularly Western tradition in which we think it's important to identify yourself. But then it's interesting to think about the things that go with that. Do you say first name? Do you say first name and second name? Do you say first name and second name and the organization? Are you forced to always name the organization? Hello, welcome to this telco. You're talking to Cameron. If I say that and I don't give you my last name, I'm indicating that I'm giving you a name just to be somewhat familiar with you. Now, I think all these, I think we all know they're important to think about. I think sometimes service designers just default to the societal norm. If you think about it as an anarchist anthropologist, you start to think, okay, well, how do I create relation? When do I create relation? What is the nature of that relation? Um, and when people give their names and how familiar they are. Obviously, there are services in which people are very formal and no one would ever ask a name or give a name. And then the classic anthropology is to always say that if services are about being in relation, the best way to get into relation is normally some kind of gift. Gifting has a complicated history. Marcel Mauss's work in anthropology, fantastic stuff. Really get into it if you want to read all that. But on the other hand, it's just a matter of saying, and again, most good service designers recognize this, that at some point in a service, there will be some gifting, hopefully not cynical, which is like when you get a petit four at the end of a restaurant and it comes to you with a very large bill. And it's a bit like you take a little spoonful of sugar every time you have your medicine. So not something cynical like that, but literally actually giving a gift when it comes, not just at the end, but at the beginning. It's a way of creating a relation which isn't only about this service. And it just means that I'm recognizing base level communism. I'm recognizing that there are people here. I'm recognizing that these people may or may not want to be identified. I'm recognizing that even if they're paid, they are giving something of themselves to this. And they're not giving it freely, which means they are giving it. If you kind of give a gift freely, then it's kind of like your choice. But they're kind of feeling obligated that they need the money, they're doing the job, but nevertheless they are still, to some extent, giving of themselves to this particular service relation. So I think that communism just can start to help think about service design in very interesting ways. The exchange is more complicated, and the main point I want to draw out here is the one that Dave Graeber indicates, which is exchange is about establishing an equivalence. And this was the one that really blew my mind when I first read it, that any exchange negotiation has to begin with the presumption that the parties are equal. As soon as there's a sense that people aren't equal, it's not a real negotiation. It's not actually, you can't actually establish an equivalence because someone has power over you, which moves it into the next category, hierarchy. I think this is really interesting to think about for two reasons. It means that a service is when I agree to be in a particular powered relation with you, an all-powerful customer telling a butler what to do, or an all-powerful doctor telling a passive patient which is what the word patient means, what to do. They're the ones suffering. So I'm entering a power relation. I'm handing over my body. I'm putting myself at your service. I am requiring a service of you. But it's important to recognize that that's just the service relation, and there will always be a getting into and getting out of. And that's when people are equivalent and then return to equivalence. And a lot of the last bit of the article about please and thank you in lots of different languages is about that, about this weird way in which particularly Westerners and the global capital, the global consumer class as a result of globalized capital, means everybody has these still funny anthropological ways of saying, look, it's totally been a paid for interaction. I've asked for a service, I've paid for it. It's a contract, legal contract binding. Um, and then we've kind of ended. But then there will still be all these rituals about thank you, no, it's nothing, don't worry, and this sort of weird game, almost competitive game that Graeber draws attention to at the end of that. So I think it's really interesting to think about these. These are moments that one almost doesn't want to formalize or wants to think about the way in which, as a designer, you can scaffold their improvised interaction in this kind of way. And the other key thing is that, as I said, it's this sort of movement into and out of relation, and a moment in which service designers should never just design the service. Like, we know this because we all do customer journeys and service blueprints, but we do it functionally. We don't think anthropologically. There's a moment in which people are negotiating as equals. And then there's a kind of funny transition moment. If you think in a doctor's, you arrive, you talk to a receptionist, you are more or less equal, and then you say, I now agree, and you go into a special room, it's like a theatre, and you take off your clothes and get into a little robe. And so there's this transition moment in which you literally adopt the role of being the patient. Now, obviously not in all types of medical, I'm using that just as one. But there will be that transition moment. So there's not just even three moments, there's more like five. There's equality, agreement. There's the transition. There's the power role play, which will always be asymmetrical in the service, no matter how co-creation of value it is. Then there's the putting your clothes back on. And then there's being released from obligation. And one of the big points that Graeber makes is that the point about paying for a service is that the payment is the indication that I don't need to know you anymore. That's the end of it. I put myself into a temporary relation. Exchange is a temporary friendship. And it's not, I have ongoing obligations after this. At the end of it, when I've paid you, or if I'm in North America and I've tipped you, I've effectively said, that's it. Like, you're dead to me, you're a stranger to me. This is always interesting if somebody's trying to be customer centered, because custom is all about habitual return. So it's always interesting to think about the ending of each event of a service, because you're trying to say you're free, but you're also trying to say, I hope you come back. Right. So I think this is what is interesting when you read Graeber in terms of exchange. And then the last one I'll just talk to very briefly. Again, this was really quite mind expanding when I first read it. So Graeber has a very anarchist's version of hierarchy, which you would expect it's anti-hierarchy, but instead, certainly there is the type of authority at the point of a gun, a mode of violence. Anthropologically, it's not very efficient to get good service out of people by threatening them with violence. He writes a whole nother book about violence, by the way, if you want to read the Utopia of Rules, where he talks about bureaucracy. There's an extensive discussion about violence and the way in which it has a force of silencing. But if I want good service and service in an authority relation, if I'm a king and I want people to serve me, I can't just keep sort of threatening them with violence, even if that's in the background, but certainly not if it's present at the moment. And so Graeber recognizes that hierarchy should much more be understood as a tradition, an accepted set of relations that just continue, that are asymmetrical. They're not the opposite of reciprocal, as he says in this paragraph. So there's this weird tradition that these people give to that person. It's always happened annually. They come and they bring stuff and they give it to the king. And that's what puts the king in authority over them, that there's this ritual, this tradition. That's a really anarchist version of hierarchy because it means that it's a kind of consented to, somewhat consented to, because you do it over and over again. I found this, I wrote an article with Lucy Kimball in the big handbook for service design that just came out. And I found this really interesting, important when thinking about government services. That government, a lot of people who've been doing government service design have been doing customer-centered design of government interactions, really focusing on desludging and reducing friction and pain points and maximizing convenience. I have concerns about that because I think it's very interesting to think about citizen-centered versus customer-centered design. And I think there's something really important about recognizing that if you turn your government into a transactional, temporary relation, you have no allegiance to your government when they have to ask you to do something like lock down during a pandemic or get vaccinated or ask you to suddenly agree to start paying more taxes so that we can actually start building resilient climate change. It's very difficult for a government to have authority when you've turned them into exchange. So then there's this kind of question, okay, well, if you service design, it doesn't mean making it inconvenient and sludgy. It doesn't mean returning to bureaucracy. But it does mean trying to learn from anthropology about how to attract authority, how to kind of signal expertise and deserved authority, how to actually sort of present that. And one of the other lessons would therefore be to try and make it consistent as an experience. In order to build up that sense of tradition. Like, I'm being a bit stupid here, but an example of the first is that I find it really frustrating when corporate, when government service design is indistinguishable from a financial institution. It just has the same kind of blue and kind of easy read English. And obviously, there are reasons to do some of those designs. But I think when you can't tell the difference between a bank and a government service design, in this case, digital, but even if it's going into your motor vehicle registry office, I just feel in that sense you've lost the importance of being in a situation of authority, of recognizing authority. I certainly am not advocating here for authoritarian government. What I'm trying to say is designing services so that they have a ritual, a regularity, so that something can come from that. That I think when you go everything into exchange. So I think it's really important to think about services as hierarchy, as exchange, but as things you enter and get out of, and as this baseline communism. And so I was kind of giving you that chapter because I do really want to emphasize that service is about helping people get into collaborative relations, not relationships. And it really causes you to think about how to get people into and out of. How do they get into authority? How do they get out of authority? How do they get into exchange? How do they get out of it? And how do you do that without undermining sort of baseline communism and the fact that people do generally want to help each other in some ways? So I hope that explains a little bit why I gave it to you. I bet you I've talked way too long. I wasn't looking at a clock. Yes, I have. Now I'm very happy to hear questions that must have occurred to you while you were reading this strange thing or anything that I've said. So please just come at me. If you don't want to speak, you can chuck something in the chat.